Hi, and welcome to the Science of Reading modules. I'm Dr. Jenny French, Adolescent Literacy Specialist and School Leadership Consultant. This is a continuation of the Science Reading modules in the Middle School Methods course. So we're picking up in session 4. In this session, we're discussing building comprehension through background knowledge and text structure. Some of our objectives this session is to really dive in to how background knowledge and text structure impact student reading comprehension. We're also going to be tackling vocabulary, a little bit of a review, and some new information from session 3, and really looking at strategies that we can apply to our classroom regardless of what subject area we're teaching. We're going to look at some reading strategies that really scaffold complex text. And then at the end of the module, you're going to have an opportunity to really apply the theories that we're talking about and the strategies that we're discussing and apply those to a scenario that you'll likely experience. So just as a refresh from our previous session 3, it may have been a little bit since you have discussed the science of reading. So I want to do a quick recap or review from the science of reading modules 1 through 3, so we can pick up where we last left our discussion. So if you remember our statistic based on our NAEP, or National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is our national test, according to our 2024 NAEP data, 70% of 8th grade students are not reading on grade level. The data is also reflective and very similar at grades 4 and grades 12. That rate is even higher for minority groups. And a recent study done out of the state of California showed that even in 2-parent households where both parents or guardians were college educated, still there were 49% of those students in those homes were not reading on grade level. So as we continue our conversation in the next few modules, I really want to internalize that statistic and translate it so that you can see when you're standing up in front of your classroom, you can keep in mind that about 70% of your students are not reading on grade level, and they won't be able to independently access the text that you put in front of them. So that's what these modules are about. Equipping you with some reading strategies to help your students, because the majority of them will not be able to access your text. So not only are you a content area teacher, you also have to be a literacy support. So we'll talk a little bit about why they work, how they work, and then what that looks like in your classroom when you apply it. If you remember Scarborough's reading rope, it depicts everything that happens in your brain simultaneously in order to have reading comprehension. So this rope is really a visual demonstration. So where all those braids and threads, strands come together on the right, that represents reading comprehension. So we have this myth that we are teaching or assessing reading comprehension as this one thing, when in reality, it is multiple skills happening simultaneously, and those are represented on the left side by those individual threads in the rope. At the bottom of the rope, we have the strands. That strand is called word recognition, and those are the skills that are focused on in kindergarten through 2nd grade, or for 5 to 7-year-olds, and we assume that students master these skills by the time they leave 2nd grade. So this strand really is called where we're learning to read. If we look at the strand above, those are the language comprehension strands. This is what ELA teachers focus on when they're teaching 3rd grade through 12th grade. So for ages 8 and 9 and up, we're looking at these things. But with that 70% of students not reading on grade level, we have many students who have not mastered word recognition skills, and they are in our middle and high school classrooms. And this is very anxiety inducing for secondary teachers because you are becoming experts in your content area. Teaching a student how to decode a word and teaching them phonics is a completely different skill set. So you don't have to have a separate reading degree, but it is important that you are armed with enough strategies and skills and understanding to be able to support all the learners in your classroom. So whether they're a striving reader, or a multi-language learner, you'll be able to help support their reading comprehension. Another important model to discuss is the simple view of reading. And it takes those two strands, the word recognition and the language comprehension, and it puts them into a multiplication equation. So this really demonstrates that we have to have both areas mastered in order to have reading comprehension. If I am a weak decoder, maybe I struggle with dyslexia, I'll have a 0 in that category. But maybe I have a strong vocabulary and background knowledge of a text, so I give myself a 1 in that category. Still, 0 times 1 is 0. So this really demonstrates that one strength can't overcompensate for a deficit in another. We have to have both. And we see this a lot. Many students might be flagged for special education when they get to 6th grade, and we'll have middle school teachers asking, how did they get this far not knowing how to read? Well, if students have strong enough language comprehension skills to really mask their decoding deficits, it is possible. They can rely on context clues and pictures and the vocabulary that they know, their own background knowledge, their inferencing skills. But when you get to 6th grade and you're reading a science text, you can't use context clues. You have to be able to decode and rely on the word, or we call these word attack skills, being able to decode and really break down a word and the parts of a word so that it makes meaning. So that's the simple view of reading. When we think about our students, our non-reading students, when we think about that 70% of students in our classroom who are not reading on grade level, they will typically fall into one of these 3 categories. So the first category on the left here is our non-decoders, and to use a metaphor, like stuck on the driveway. These are students who are struggling with basic decoding skills. When they read, they're trying to work and focus on the word level versus the sentence or the phrase or the paragraph. They're working and decoding at the individual word level. These students need basic, foundational, systematic, and explicit phonics instruction, which you will not provide for them in your class. But this is the category of students that need intervention or remediation support. And it's very difficult when a student gets to the high school level for them to receive this help. But the only way they will move forward is to learn and master these skills. The second category are what we refer to as our disfluent readers. Disfluent means not fluent. They read slow, or they read choppy, or they read monotone. And this will interfere with their comprehension. Even if they read monotone, they're going to miss a lot of inferencing, like the character was angry when they said that. So the answer is simple, maybe not easy to find in the schedule, but it's simple in the fact that they just need more practice. So there are things that we can do in our classroom to help everyone get more read aloud practice. In session 3, we talked about choral reading and echo reading and reading review as our strategies so that we are not calling individual students out. That round robin reading can be very negatively impactful. If they're a striving reader, they do not want to read out loud in front of people. And so we use things like choral, where everyone's reading out loud together so that they still can participate, but they don't have that spotlight shining on them. We also talked about the strategy of scooping, where we move from reading into words to read into phrases or chunks, using our finger to go from one word to scoop up a phrase, and how we practice prosody, dramatic readings. And our last category are our non-comprehenders, or lost on the highway. These students might decode really well and even read fluently, beautifully, but you ask them to retell or summarize, and they can't do it. So these students just need reading strategies. Maybe they're reading something, and I know we're all guilty of this, where we read something and we have to read that same paragraph 3 or 4 times because our mind was somewhere else. So having a reading strategy while you read helps keep our brain engaged and paying attention to the task at hand. And if you'll also remember, every text and every subject with every student should have a before, a during, and an after reading strategy. And that really is critical to their comprehension of any text. At no point should we ever just give a student a cold reading. Here's a text, read it alone, answer some questions. If it's important enough that they learn it and master it, we have to set it up for success and give them all the possible ways where they can access that text. We scaffold it up for them. We don't need to water down the text, meaning using AI to create it at a lower lexile, which a lot of people are doing now. It's important that they are still exposed to grade level text and the vocabulary that comes along with that. That is how they're going to close that reading gap. So we can't water down the text. We have to give them tools and strategies to help to bring their reading skills up to the level of the text. So we're going to take those strands of the rope, starting with the language comprehension strand. We're going to look at a few of the individual threads there. And the first thread we're going to pull out is the background knowledge thread. Background knowledge is critical. It is information and understanding that a reader has to have about the world or topic or a concept before they begin reading. Background knowledge will help support students in that third category of lost on the highway or non-comprehending students. So if I were to say to you, the notes are sour because the seam split, I'll give you a second to kind of digest that and think about it. What is the first thing that comes to mind? What do you think this is talking about? Some people say, is it wine? Because there's notes as in flavor. Or they'll think notes as in music. Is it something about a musical instrument? So we see things really through the lens of our own experience. So if you have experience going to vineyards, or if you have experience playing musical instruments, these might skew your thinking or perspective of where you think this is going. Because what we do, our brain automatically tries to understand and make connections with that. And so we rely on our own personal background knowledge, the understanding of the words in the text, and the personal experiences that we have had to try to make meaning of this text. So the notes were sour because the seam split. Those words are all very easily decodable. We can read them without a problem, but I don't understand the meaning behind it unless you give me some background knowledge ahead of time. So chief among factors influencing reading comprehension is background knowledge. Research clearly shows that how much readers understand about a text topic before they read it is a major factor in how much they understand while and after they read. So if I told you this sentence was about bagpipes, would it make more sense? Probably. So it comes back to those musical notes, but there's actually a fabric that contains that bag that is squeezed in order to make musical sounds. So the notes were sour or they squeaked because there was a rip in that seam. So again, here is a passage that is written at a very easy and decodable level. And I want to give you just a second to skim the passage and then try to answer the questions. Okay, I'll give you just a minute to skim the text. Okay, and then take a look at the questions and see which questions you can answer. So you might have a difficult time answering these questions, even though you were able to decode that and read it rather fluently. It might not make sense to you. So you might be in that third category of students. You can decode it, you're fluent, but you might have a hard time understanding what this is about, and you're not able to answer these questions. So the question, finding the main idea, may be difficult for you, because even if that's a skill that you can typically do very well, if you don't understand the big picture of what this is about, it's going to impact your reading comprehension. Remember the quote we just read. It's important that students know the background knowledge before they begin reading because it impacts during and after it. And that's what we're experiencing right now. So if I would have front loaded you first and told you this is about doing laundry. Okay, that makes sense. Now I can read it through that lens, and then I can see the steps in the process and I completely understand. That was the only key I really needed to unlock my comprehension for this text. So oftentimes in classrooms, we do not provide the background knowledge our students need before we begin reading. So they may have the physical reading skills that they need, but they need help supporting their background knowledge. So our prior knowledge effects are powerful. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. This is called schema. So the things in our brain that we're able to attach new information to. Our brain is like a filing cabinet, a filing system. Every piece of information has to have a place to go. It has to have a file that's there so that we can make these connections. So there's also a myth that people think some people are just curious by nature and others are not. Humans are only curious about things that they already know a little bit about. I'm not going to be curious about how to build a motorcycle engine because I have absolutely no idea about that. It would be my learning curve is too steep, so I have no curiosity about it. However, I do have curiosity about the changing climate in Australia because I've been there. So I understand that and I have some background knowledge of it. So I am curious about things like that. So we can activate our background knowledge, but we have to have a starting place. Prior knowledge even outweighs IQ. Something will only be meaningful and relatable to me if I have prior knowledge of it. I love this component in letter D here. Every mental operation hinges upon the ease of access to information acquired earlier in life. So maybe you tried to learn to play the guitar in middle school and maybe strummed out one or two songs, never got super proficient, but you had some basic skills. If you came back when you're 20 years old and tried to pick up learning the guitar, it probably would be easier for you to learn now because you have some prior knowledge that you can build on. You're going to be able to learn much faster than if you're starting at level 0. So easy or hard is really determined by your background. That's why it's so important for students to have as many experiences as possible. And we used to really prioritize field trips in schools to make sure students had some experiences that they could draw upon: art museums, history museums, the zoo, so they would gain some experiences because these benefit learning. And Natalie Wexler said it this way: people need to have enough facts in their heads to have what one commentator has called a knowledge party, a bunch of accumulated associations that will enable them to absorb, retain, and analyze new information. So this knowledge party really highlights the idea that a well-stocked mind is a lively, interconnected place where ideas can mingle and grow. So knowledge and experiences are critical to creating that mental file cabinet to where new information can be absorbed. So this also may be a review from Module 3, but our students are experiencing a deficit in background knowledge. And this is happening for a variety of reasons. So most of you are content area teachers, and you may be surprised to find that only 1% of primary students, meaning kindergarten, first, and second graders, are receiving instruction in science and social studies. We've put the focus really on math and reading because those are subjects that are tested. So we've eliminated science and social studies content or removed it as a subject from their daily schedule in order to accommodate more reading and math. Well, by doing this, we've also limited their background knowledge, which is critical to their reading comprehension. And now with the science of reading, this research is really bringing this understanding to the forefront. And so we're seeing a swing, a shift in the curriculum, and more of a prioritization around science and social studies that hasn't been there in the last 10 to 20 years, really with the onset of academic standards, because the academic standards were really misinterpreted by many educators. They are used as a list of things to teach, a to-do list, instead of these are outcomes or skills students should have. So that's why people have taken spelling and handwriting and even science and social studies out of the curriculum at the elementary levels, when those are things that are essential for reading comprehension later in life, even as early as when they get to middle school. So the focus on reading and math has really been a detriment to reading achievement. And even in grades 3, 4, and 5, science and social studies instruction is very limited, with students possibly receiving 1/4 of social studies instruction, and then the following quarter, their science instruction. So how do we build background knowledge? A great way to do that is from any type of presentation, video clips, photographs or images, or an experience. This resource here is called Visible Learning. It's a resource created by John Hattie, who's an Australian researcher, and this is a meta-analysis, so a study of studies. There are over 250 components in this meta-analysis. This is a two-sided document. It breaks down the effect size or the impact of everything you could possibly think of that has anything to do with education, that is a factor in the educational experience, whether it's an instructional strategy, a student's background. As some application later in this module, we're going to be looking more at this visible learning document because John Hattie has collected all of the research. So there's doesn't have to be any guesswork. As educators, we know what works best for learning and retention. So we should be utilizing these strategies that are research-based, where you can even get up to 3 years growth in 1 year for utilizing these type of strategies. And with so many of our students being several grade levels behind, we have to be leveraging these high impact strategies. But another way we build background knowledge is making sure that we are keeping text at grade level so that they're still getting exposure to that rich vocabulary. That is critical. And shifting to longer and deeper units of study. So instead of covering all of World War II in 1 or 2 weeks, we're going to look at it for an entire semester. And that might not be reflective of the standards, but that is just an example of a shift from covering topics very shallowly to really knowing something and knowing it in depth and well. If you remember our discussion on practice, so many times we don't give students enough practice to actually become independent or proficient with a skill before we force them on to the next thing. So they never develop that independence. It's not because they have any type of deficiency. It's because we did not provide enough practice with a skill or concept. It's important to get a gauge on what students, what they know and what they don't know. We can do this by doing a quick survey with students, a true or false quiz, a KWL chart, what they know, what they want to know, and what they learned. And you can do that, those types of things, whole group as a before reading strategy to help you get a gauge or a handle on where you really need to spend your time building background knowledge. A lot of times teachers, we assume that students have background knowledge in a subject. And if we make that assumption and we're wrong, then it's going to impact their comprehension for the rest of the unit. So this is a really important first step that will be critical to the rest of their achievement during this unit. So some students might require background building, but all students can still benefit from it. So slowing down and taking time to really build background knowledge is important, and it doesn't have to take forever. You don't have to lose days of instruction. Doing something quick, even if it's 3 to 5 minutes to help activate prior knowledge, build curiosity, and provide the context, the meaning, the relevance for what we're doing, just like the laundry example. So giving them some understanding of what they're reading before they begin reading it. In one of our previous sessions, we also reviewed the baseball study. They've taken 4 groups of students. 2 groups are high achieving readers and 2 groups are low achieving readers. And they've tested them over a passage on baseball. Here's a passage, read it and answer the questions. What we found reliably is that the second highest scoring group are the low readers, but the ones that have the higher background knowledge always out-achieve the students who do not have background knowledge. Think of all of the vocabulary that's in baseball, pitcher, mound, field, pop fly. If you're not a baseball player or as a child you haven't experienced that or played, your understanding of that reading passage is going to be completely impacted by your lack of vocabulary and background knowledge of how to play the game. So the next thread we're going to move to is language structures. And language structures encompasses syntax and semantics. And language structure really refers to how words are combined to form phrases and sentences that convey meaning. And again, this strand is really supporting that third group of students, those non-comprehenders. So they can decode, they can read fluently, but they're not understanding what they're reading. Syntax is the study of sentence structure, and written syntax is very different from verbal or oral syntax. The way that we speak and the way that text is written is highly different and highly more complex in writing than it is in speech. They'll use confusing pronouns, so students will lose track of who the speaker is or what is being talked about. But there are things that we can do within our classroom to help support this. And some of those strategies are breaking down text or using GIST, which is a summarizing strategy, and then just helping students be aware that there is a difference in how the sentence structure is from speech to print. Even in different genres of text, they're going to find different types of sentence structure. That's helpful for them to understand, because many students will think that if they're trying to read a difficult science text, they'll just say, I'm not good at science, when really they just don't have a strategy for reading that. Maybe they're a good reader and reading just a simple fiction, something that they're really interested in. But if they get to a science text and they don't understand it, they'll just say, oh, I'm just bad at science. And it has nothing to do with being good or bad at science. It has everything to do with, I don't know how to break down this difficult, complex text. So it's important to know that children do not need to know all of the formal names of the grammatical terms. What they really need to know is how a sentence functions and how a sentence works in speech and in writing. And we need to practice working with sentences when we begin reading a complex text. And we're going to do some strategies together to help break down text. Even though you are an expert in your content area, you still are a literacy teacher as well. So we are going to look at an example of a social studies text on the Dust Bowl. In this passage, we are going to find a lot of possible barriers to comprehension. So first, let's talk about the sentence structure. I'm going to skip down to the underlined sentence, which are a few complex sentences. So caused by a combination of severe drought and poor farming practices, it was a series of massive dust storms that ravaged the land and made life extremely difficult for residents. So just stopping right there. So that sentence structure really presents a challenge to reading comprehension. So let's take a look at the second underlined sentences. Families struggled to grow crops or raise livestock, leading to widespread poverty and hunger. So those longer sentences that can be a lot to process. And remember, we're still talking about our students who can read and decode fluently. They're just not understanding. If we put in our students who are very disfluent in the mix here, that are going to really struggle just at the word level, not even the sentence level, they need a lot of support with how to break down this text. Another difficulty obviously will be the vocabulary. So there's just a few of some words that are highlighted in red there that would be maybe unfamiliar for a student or not used in their everyday language. The pronoun antecedent reference are the pronouns that are used to reference the noun or subject. So in this text, some of our pronoun antecedent reference are the Dust Bowl, which is what we're talking about, but then it, dust storms, black blizzards, they, and it again. So all of those words are used to reference the Dust Bowl. Striving readers often, when they are reading that, they will think Dust Bowl, dust storms, and black blizzard are all separate things, or it and they'll lose track of who and what that's referring to. That's why in lower lexile text, you'll find less pronouns and more nouns repeated over and over again to help the struggling reader really track the text of who's talking about what. So, and content area text is dense. Most paragraphs are like this. So it can be very exhausting and tedious for our adolescent readers to get through and understand text like this, which is the most common type of text we're going to find in our content areas at the high school level. So I want to share a strategy with you called breaking down text. Now, this is a strategy that has to be modeled for students the first several times before they can do it independently. So I would do it whole group. So to start off, you want them to just skim the text, and they'll very quickly say, what does that mean? I don't get it. Then we activate our process. So step one, we're going to be replacing all of the punctuation with the period. So every colon, semicolon, or comma, you're going to replace with a period. So you want to have digital annotation tools, or if you can mark it out, if you can print it and have it on physical paper, that's even better. So students would go through and they would change all of those punctuation marks to a period. What this step does, why this is important, and because your brain is trained that a period is a stopping point, we are chunking the content. So instead of students getting caught up in a long, complex sentence structure, they're able to chunk out the content more so it's easier to take in as input and easier to understand. The next step then is circling any unfamiliar words. So those words that they may have never seen before, or they may have seen, but it doesn't make sense in this context. So maybe they see the word sober and it doesn't make sense in this context. So they would circle as being unfamiliar. And they're going to circle different words because, again, everybody has an individualized vocabulary bank based on their experiences. So you would go through and circle that. And then we find synonyms for those unfamiliar words. Now, we don't want to take too much time to do this. So this isn't a lesson about synonyms or using a thesaurus. They can use AI, they can use a Google search. The point is helping their comprehension on breaking down this text. And so you're going to just use even ChatGPT and just do your voice activation are some synonyms for abated and get that list. The students choose one and then write it on their paper where they've circled abated. Then they're going to write a synonym that they understand above it. So once they've done that, they've chunked the long sentence structure into short content pieces, and then they've replaced all the difficult vocabulary with words they understand. Then they reread the passage and you see light bulbs start coming on because now they can understand it. And then the final piece to that is to summarize in one sentence what you just read or what this character was trying to portray. So once they do that, then they can share out, do a turn and talk. And many students will say, why didn't he just say that? Well, he did say that. They just said it in a different language that we're not used to hearing or speaking. This is great to use with any type of dense text or Shakespeare or anything that's just heavy with content and unfamiliar vocabulary. This can be used with early elementary kids all the way through university students. You would not utilize this process for an entire text, really just to get students started. And it really helps them. The point is for you to help highlight the fact that we engage with text differently. How I read my beach fiction novel is different from how I read difficult text like this. I need a strategy in order to approach that. So that's what this strategy is really about, showing students that we have to stop, slow down, break down text. It's a process to understand. It requires stamina, but if you do it maybe once a week with a paragraph or two, it helps develop those skills. And so when they get into another classroom, it becomes internalized and it's like a default. It gives them a strategy to know at least how to approach a hard text. So that is called breaking down text. So now we're going to move to semantics, or the study of word, phrase, and sentence meanings. And semantics is really an umbrella for word relationships. More specifically, we'll find them in our academic standards with this language: gradients or shades of meaning, synonyms and antonyms, and figures of language. So we're going to break each of those down. So one activity that helps support our multilanguage learners also is called semantic features. And so, for example, we have some descriptions here going down the left column and objects across the top. So students just put a plus or minus sign in each column. And this really helps with the accuracy and precision of language and understanding just the small variances of what makes things different. For example, does a cup have a handle? Can a cup be ceramic? Is it round? Is it tall? Does it hold hot liquid, cold liquid? Is it paper or is it transparent? How is that different from a glass, a mug, a bowl? So these are called semantic features. You could also do this with characters in a story. Put the different characters across the top, and then characteristics down the left. And this helps students when there's a text that has multiple characters that you're trying to follow and really do those compare and contrast to create semantic features. You can use a similar approach with battles of a war. So you can have multiple battles and then the different characteristics of those and what did they have in common, what was different. As far as word relationships go and figurative language is typically in most middle and high school academic standards. However, research has shown us that there is not a return on the investment for teaching those in isolation. And sometimes we spend a lot of times teaching what a simile is, a metaphor, idioms. Teaching those just in isolation is not transferring. It's not benefiting their reading comprehension. So the best way to really teach those is by front loading the text and explaining those ahead of time. So calling those out. The same with polysemous words with multiple meaning, words like stand or bank. There are multiple meanings for that word. So identifying those words and then identifying the context that it's used in the upcoming text is really important as part of a pre or before reading strategy. Another activity is called semantic mapping, and this can be a before reading strategy and an after reading strategy. So we start with whatever the topic is. This example here is about transportation. We start with what do we know? What words, semantics go with this topic? And so we just start throwing these out. So this could be a whole group activity where we're throwing words on a board. You could do small group activities where they're putting words like on a shared Google document. However, the logistics of that play out. So we're throwing the words out that we already know. So activating that prior knowledge and really gauging what their level of understanding is with this topic. Then we get into reading the text. And then after we read the text, we come back. What can we add? What words did we learn? What concepts or facts did we learn? Now we're going to organize these. They organized it by water, land, air, and space. There's no wrong way to organize the words. They are using higher order thinking skills in order to make categories, to make connections, to make comparing and contrasting happen. So the whole process is beneficial as they work through that and discuss that as a group. So this is semantic mapping. Create a big Post-it chart for the wall and leave those up for long units of study. And you continue to add Post-its to it as you continue to learn and grow your vocabulary around that topic. So this brings us to vocabulary, or having the knowledge of word meanings, word parts like prefixes and suffixes and roots, and how words relate to one another. Again, our vocabulary is also benefiting our students who are non-comprehenders. This is the cognitive model of a reading assessment. And you're going to do a little bit with this model when you get to your simulation. So this is helpful to really decipher where a student is struggling and getting to the root of their problem, finding the origin of where that deficit may lie. After we test them, we're going to identify if their weakness is in automatic word recognition, language comprehension, or strategic knowledge. If we find that their deficit is really in word recognition, they do not have automaticity. When they see a word, they have to work through it, memorize it, try to recall it, decode it, that type of thing. Then we work backwards, test their fluency. Are they fluent? Going backwards again, what is their decoding like? Going backwards again, what is their sound symbol awareness, or do they know print? So this helps us really diagnose and then work backwards to find the hole and then fill it. So if it's a language comprehension issue, then we work on background knowledge, vocabulary, and that knowledge of text and sentence structure, which we're really focusing on these three things in this session 4. It is critical that we have a common vocabulary instructional routine, and a good one. We want to use one that's research-based and where we use and manipulate a word multiple times. So if you think of a word as in the middle of here, and this is a spider web, as many different ways that I can utilize this word or practice this word, it's going to help it stick better. I'm going to retain it more. So the more webs or points that I can mess with this word, it's going to help me understand it and retain it. So that might look like the definition, the words here, the definition, a synonym, an antonym, using it in context, an image or picture, having a personal experience with it, knowing the roots and the prefixes. So all that we can do is just going to help us have a deeper understanding of this word. And here are a few of the high impact instructional routines that can be utilized. Vocabulary is the key to complex thinking. A person who knows more words can speak and even think more precisely about the world. A person who knows the terms scarlet, crimson, azure, and indigo can think about colors in a different way than a person who is limited to red and blue. Words divide the world. The more words we have, the more complex ways we can think about the world. So not only are students limited by the vocabulary that they have for communication, it also impacts their ability to think. It puts me in mind of a toddler who doesn't have the words to say, give me that toy, so they bite some. Not having the vocabulary that you need to express yourself even limits the ability to think. It limits your imagination and the ideas that you have. To give us a little bit of a reference point of where students are with vocabulary, we know students who are living in households where they're receiving government assistance. They are typically spoken to with less words, with less description, and typically in imperative sentences. So when they come to school, school may seem very different. And it's almost like learning a second language. If they're not used to being spoken to with description and lots of details, it can seem overwhelming and a lot to process. Or if they're questioned and they're not used to being asked questions or answering questions. Children in households of professional parents typically have an expressive vocabulary that's twice as high as working class parents, and a receptive vocabulary of 5 times as high. Receptive vocabulary is the input, words coming in that I can understand, and expressive is words I know well enough that I can speak them and use them in my personal lexicon. And this can create the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect meaning the rich get richer. I have to know at least 90% of the words in the text so my brain can fill in the gaps of the other 10%. If I only know 70% of the words in the text, the gap is too great. I cannot fill that in based on my knowledge. That is going to impact my reading comprehension. I will not understand or retain that text. I have to know at least 90% of words in the text. So to think back to the drought passage that we just read, students would need to know 90% of the words in that text in order to comprehend it. And then they would still need a reading strategy like breaking down the text to help them with long sentence structure, those pronoun antecedents. So there are typically 3 major obstacles to learning vocabulary. The first one is the sheer number of words that we have in the English language. The English language is one of the largest vocabularies at around 2 million words, and we add new words every year. The second struggle with learning vocabulary is that it's typically decontextualized. For example, if we're going to do a social studies unit, we have 13 words this week. We give the students a list of words and ask them to look them up or use them in a sentence or make flashcards with them, but they're very much decontextualized. They're not in any type of meaningful context, or they don't have relevance to our lives. The third challenge is the usage of the word. Being able to understand a word when I hear it is very different from knowing it and utilizing it in my regular conversation. That involves knowing more than a definition. Have to be able to know a word well enough to use it in my speech and use it in my writing. So another challenge that we find with vocabulary is talking about dialect, the terms code switching. It's helpful for students to understand that there are different registers or categories of language. The way that I speak with my friends should be different than the way that I speak in an interview or with my boss. And many of them don't understand that there are these categories, and this will affect their professional life also. So it's okay to have a way that you speak with your family and friends, but then when you're in a different context, you code switch and you change the language you're using, you change the word choice, how you're speaking in complete sentences and specific, more professional word choice, maybe more descriptions than how you speak casually with your family and friends. And a good example of that is even Starbucks. When I go into Starbucks, they have their own vocabulary. I can't just go say, I want a small hot coffee. It's got to be a tall hike. But the ability to switch back and forth between how I speak in one way and the other is called code switching. And we want students to be able to know a word well enough that they're using it in their speech and that they're using it in their writing. And one of the ways that we can help them develop this is by helping them understand synonyms and antonyms, the parts of speech, any kind of comparisons, examples, non-examples, pictures or graphics, or if the opportunity presents itself to even act the word out. The magic number is 5. We really want at least 5 interactions or different things to know about this word in order to move it into our idiolect or our linguistic repertoire. We need at least 5 different things of sticking points to help us obtain or absorb that word. So our vocabulary instruction should include first, an intentional word selection. We have to be very specific about the words that we want to spend time on directly, explicitly teaching. But we also need this language immersion to where we're modeling great speech. We have curriculum that has a rich vocabulary also. And we want to emphasize the importance of knowing all the parts of the word. Morpheme mapping is being able to pull all of the pieces of the word out and show the students that eruption, E means out, rupt means birth, ION is the act of. So the act of bursting out. And when you show them that visual and they understand that eruption just isn't one word with one meaning, but it's these little parts of the word that build meaning, is mind-blowing to them. So those visuals and helping them understand that is crucial to their linguistic growth. And we need to put the words that we're teaching in some type of context, like our mental filing cabinet. Why is this important? What's the relevance? So that they can organize that and file it away and then retrieve it when it's needed. For our multi-language learners, it's important to understand that they can become conversational in English in 1 to 3 years, but to really move into that academic language in their writing takes 5 to 7 years. And sometimes if they can adapt conversationally, it can be misleading for teachers because they can think that all of their students have the same level academically. Academic language is like learning a second language, even for native English speakers. Students will implicitly gain a large vocabulary by intense exposure to rich language interspersed with brief discussion of meanings. Furthermore, they believe that it's more efficient to spend time listening and reading interesting materials. Implicit instruction is just from being surrounded by language, from picking it up, from listening to it, from hearing it, from being a reader. Explicit instruction is that specific instruction. Here's the word that I'm teaching, like eruption. We're pulling out all the word parts. We're talking about the definition. I'm going to show you pictures of volcanoes erupting. The human brain, for people between the ages of 2 and 17, they can obtain or acquire up to 15 new words a day. But to keep a student on pace academically, they need to learn at least 2,000 to 3,000 words a year. So we have to be very specific about the words that we choose to give explicit instruction to, because that's very time consuming. And the best way to do that is to ask ourselves the question, how do our students need to know this word? Do they need to just hear it and know it in context? If so, implicit instruction is okay. Or do they have to be able to use it, write about it, talk about it, know it in the next 3 years. Then if that's the case, explicit instruction should happen. And if we're familiar with the tiered vocabulary, tier 1 words are really those words that everyone knows. Tier 2 words are our higher cross-content words. And tier 3 are really our academic or domain-specific words. We're just using these words when we're in a specific field or context. Well, research shows us that we need to prioritize tier 2 words. We will receive the more return on our investment if we teach these words explicitly. If I were to pull back up our text from earlier, the Dust Bowl, and take some time to go through and utilize what those tier 2 words might be, there is no right or wrong answer of, is this a tier 2 word? There's no vocabulary police that are going to come and tell you, no, that's a tier 3, not a tier 2. And it really depends on what your student's background knowledge is. I might not have to teach the word livestock to students living in Wyoming. I may have to teach the students who live in New Jersey the term livestock, though. So geography, dialect, our personal experiences will really also dictate what words we need to front load and teach. When we teach a word explicitly, presenting it in its word family is also very helpful for students to see that this word erodes. You can also find it in the word erosion, erosive, erodibility. So you can see the connections there. It's not a completely separate word with a completely different meaning. Here's another look at those word families and what it might look like. So the word sign, and students very commonly ask about the G in sign. Well, sign comes from the word signature, and so it's a silent in the word sign, but that's why it's there. So presenting sign as a root word and all the different ways that we may see the root word. It's also helpful if in your classroom you can have a word wall. So maybe you have a word wall similar to this. So there's a root and then all the possible words that you could see that you would find that root in. A word wall might also look like this. So this is a science word wall. And so every word that they've learned, the definition, picture, student-friendly definition, an image, and then that goes on the wall for reference later throughout the year or the unit. Vocabulary bookmarks are also very helpful. So you can just cut these out and they can put them in their text, or you can have a digital online version. So when they come across a word they don't know, they can jot it down and then the page number, and then they can come back to that later. Then they can transfer these words into their own personal dictionary. And then they can add, or something like a 6-column vocabulary organizer. You can create these digitally or even just in a composition notebook, or utilize the graphic organizer. But you can see we're taking the word and then we're doing those multiple things with the word. Remember, at least 5 times to get into our idiolect. So what is the definition? What's the part of speech? We need a synonym, we need an antonym, use an example or a non-example, but an image or picture. And then we come back to these space practice. We retrieve this every once in a while, and that will help us with our long-term retention of this vocabulary. The next thread in our Scarborough's reading rope that we're going to talk about is verbal reasoning. So verbal reasoning refers to the ability to understand and reason using concepts framed in words. Another easy way to say it is reading between the lines. So verbal reasoning can cover inferencing, figurative language, and logical reasoning. Like I mentioned, how do we read between the lines of what the text is really saying? Or when we come across things like metaphors and similes, especially students that are English language learners will definitely struggle with any type of figurative language. So that has to be directly explained. And then logical reasoning is really the cause and effect. You can kind of think of it this way. Your brain is always trying to fill the gaps. So remember when I said the notes were sour because the seam split? Your brain is trying to fill in the holes and make the guesses of what that means. Or like when you text someone and then they text you back and you see the bubbles and then the text never comes through. What happens? Your brain is filling in the holes of what you think is happening. Why didn't they text back? So you're filling it. Your brain naturally does this. And that's what inferencing is. And that's really what verbal reasoning does. Let's do a few examples. So if I said to you, he shook off his umbrella and stepped outside under the gray skies. Without telling you directly, you can imply what the weather is. Well, it was raining, and maybe he's stepping outside because it just stopped raining. I didn't tell you it was raining, but you put together those clues of the wet umbrella and the gray skies. Or if I said the teacher came to collect the homework and my stomach dropped, what inference could you make? Well, either they don't have their homework ready, the dog ate it, they're not prepared. So something bad happened to the homework. That's why they're having this physical reaction. And everybody has had that reaction to where something bad's happened and they can feel it uncomfortable in their stomach. Or this one, she paused, eyes darting to the door. At the end of the corridor, it was slightly ajar. She could have sworn she'd closed it. You can make a lot of implications about this text, about someone sneaking in. It didn't say directly that the lady was afraid because she saw the door was open and she thought someone snuck in. No, but we piece that together by the language that was used. One of the other pieces of verbal reasoning are those gradients. Sometimes standards or states use the term gradients. Sometimes they use shades of meaning. But this is really about precision of language and word choice. So not just saying I'm mad. Being mad is different from being upset, and that's different from being furious or irate. So understanding the levels or degrees of a word. So for example, if this is our word bank, and when we do this, we want to provide the word bank for students because sometimes the only word they have for mad is mad. So we have to provide the other words, the synonyms for it. So I could use something like a word ladder, or teachers will go to like Lowe's or Walmart and get the paint strips, have the colors or the shades where it goes from light to dark. And then we move the words into low gradient to high gradient, or weak to strong. So something might be meaningless, then it's trivial, then it's important, then it's noteworthy, then it's critical. So seeing just where that degree of importance or degree of strength of a word is. So if I tell you something is important and then I say it's critical, there's a difference there. So we went over some of the threads of background knowledge, vocabulary, and verbal reasoning. What is new information for you? What is the most important to remember? And what is one action item you have? Now you'll move through the scenarios in the module to help you apply some of our learning. See you next time.